Into this landscape enters Joseph Kosuth, who I think of more as a philosopher than a traditional studio artist, say like Jackson Pollock or even Warhol. Kosuth was interested in linguistics, how languages develop, and semiotics, the study of signs and symbols. So he was, looking at this diverse history of modern art, and he thought, if all of this stuff is considered art and yet they're so different, how can they all fundamentally still be considered the same thing? What could possibly tie all of these together? And he determined that it wasn't something like media or materials or genre or process that necessarily determined that all these things could be art, but rather it was the intention that they be. Or as Kosuth put it, all of these things are essentially propositions concerned with the definition of art. And this proposition is essentially an idea or a concept. And what becomes known as conceptual art is any art where the idea of the work strongly predominates over the physical work that you're presented with. Since text and language is the primary way we convey ideas to one another, a lot of conceptual art uses words. And what you're seeing here are a couple of different text pieces by Kosuth that I think of as sort of serious and non-serious at the same time. I see these as sort of poking fun at minimalism or the idea of kind of pure formalist works. Kosuth has a sort of an ongoing body of work known as his 1 in 3 series, which I think of as more like visual proposals. And they play with the way we assign meaning to a given object. So think back to Magritte's The Treachery of Images. It's working on a very similar idea. In his 1 in 3 chair series, he presents a wooden folding chair, a mounted photograph of a chair, and the photographic enlargement of a dictionary definition of a chair. So which is the real chair, or do they all contain elements of chairness? In the same way, Kosuth might ask us to think about what is the real art. It's a silly question. It's all the real art, and they're all the real chairs. It just depends on how they function, and it depends on what your intention is with the object. For instance, if you need to sit down, then you'll probably pick the chair in the middle. If you need an image of a chair for a photographic essay, you'll probably pick the photograph of the chair. And if you're writing a poem and the character needs to sit down, you'll probably use the text version of the chair. So to think about it more broadly as it relates to art, Kosuth is asking, what is the real art? Well, the answer is, it's anything we need it to be. So in the wake of conceptualism, artists are not limited to certain genres or certain processes or certain media to make quote-unquote real art. For in the wake of conceptual art, any material an artist can imagine, any process an artist can think about doing are all open to the territory of art making. It only depends on what the artist's intention is and what materials or processes will adequately fulfill that intention. So conceptual art ended up being very fertile ground for artists working in the 60s and 70s to develop sort of new ideas and trajectories for art making and thinking about the processes for making their work. And one of these styles of art that really gains some attention becomes known as body art or performance art. And performance art really has its origins in the early 20th century with some of the avant-garde artists we've looked at, like the Futurists and the Dadaists. And ideas about the performative aspects of art making were in the mix in the mid-century as early as the 1950s, with ideas put forth by an art critic named Harold Rosenberg. Rosenberg was interested particularly in the work of Jackson Pollock, but not in the physicality of the paintings themselves, not in the formal aspects of the paintings. But Rosenberg was really interested in the way Pollock made his paintings. And he notes there's a new generation of artists who are more fixated on process than product. And he said that what's changed with modern painters is that the canvas isn't necessarily a place to create and reproduce an object, but rather he calls the canvas an arena, a place in which to act. And in that way, he starts talking about works of art not as objects, but as events. So we're just going to look at a few of these artists as we kind of wrap things up here. The first is a Japanese artist named Kazuo Shiraga. And Shiraga was a member of a collective of modern artists working in Japan known as the Gutai movement. And as I understand it, Gutai is a Japanese term that relates to the physicality or the materiality of an object or material. Shiraga made a series of large-scale paintings by soaking the canvas with pigment and then moving his feet expressively over the surface, making violent and energetic marks. Shiraga was interested in a kind of beauty that arises when something becomes damaged or decayed. His canvases often look ravaged to the point of destruction, or they look like the scene of some ferocious act.